All right. It is 6:01. I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone. Happy first day of the spookiest month and a full moon. It's a very, very auspicious evening for this. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation, and I'm so glad that you're all here. Just a little bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development, while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, all of which are now virtual, and most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth, and the value of preservation and spookiness in our communities. We're a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our wonderful new website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. And I am also very pleased to thank our co-hosts for this evening, the Merchants House Museum and the Village Alliance. In a little bit, I will put their links into the chat so that you can learn more about them and their wonderful work. I am also very pleased tonight to welcome Village Preservation's new programs assistant, Lena Rubin, and to virtually introduce you all to her. Hi, Lena. Lena will be here with us in the chat and the Q&A this evening. So even though we won't be visible, please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or raise any issues or thoughts. But if you have questions specifically for tonight's speaker about the talk, please use the Q&A function for that. So I am very pleased to introduce tonight's speaker. Andrea Janes writes ghost stories and is the owner and founder of Burrows of the Dead LLC, a boutique tour company dedicated to dark and unusual walking tours of New York City. Her obsessions include New York City history, slapstick comediennes, witches, ghosts, all things nautical, and also beer. So thank you. Thank you so much for being here, and Andrea, take us away.
All right. Thank you so much, Arielle. Thank you, Lena. So I am really, really happy to be here. Thank you so much to everyone who's joining us. I see we have 200 people with us. That's really exciting. It's been kind of liberating to be able to take our walking tours virtual. We can cover a lot more ground, and I had the enormous pleasure of putting together some of my favorite ghost stories of Greenwich Village and the East Village into this presentation. Obviously, Greenwich Village is just simply an embarrassment of riches when it comes to incredible New York City ghost stories, and it was hard to winnow down my favorites. But there's certain places that I feel very passionate about, and there are certain places that I feel transcend rumor and urban legend and lore when it comes to being really very genuinely haunted. These places are inarguably infested with spirits. It's palpable, it's verifiable, you can research all of this, you can experience it for yourselves if you go there. So I kind of winnowed down my favorite tales of Greenwich Village. During the presentation, if at any time you're having any kind of tech issues with my audio levels, or you can't see slides or whatever, maybe just drop those comments and concerns into the chat, and maybe Arielle or Lena could tell me about them. I'll just be kind of yammering on for a little while, and then towards the end of the presentation, I'll bring things to a Q&A for you guys to jump in. And I'm gonna just sort of style this presentation with a bit of an overview of what I think makes this particular neighborhood so very haunted. And then I'm gonna delve into some of my personal favorites. So for the purposes of this talk, Greenwich Village is gonna encompass everything from the East Village, near St. Mark's and the Boweries, and places I'm gonna talk about over there, all the way over to the far West Village, Hudson Street, Bank Street, and so on. So we're encompassing really the whole East and West Village neighborhoods. If you were on my walking tour, we'd have to split those up. So again, another kind of fun, unexpected advantage of taking everything virtual. All right, so we begin with the question I get most often on my tours, which is, why is Greenwich Village so haunted? Or why are so many ghost tours offered in this particular neighborhood? Well, as a ghost tour guide, I mean, logistically, obviously, it's a very walkable neighborhood. It's a very beautiful neighborhood. And then, of course, as anybody who knows anything about ghosts can tell you, the neighborhood is chock-a-block with all kinds of icons, turbulent histories, and a whole strata of deep New York City history that goes back 400 years and further. And once you begin to excavate these things, you'll see that it's a natural breeding ground for ghosts. Of course, really of the village is, of course, Washington Square Park, and how convenient for our purposes. It just happens to be built on an old burial ground. I think this is common knowledge for most, especially for people who are big Greenwich Village history buffs. So I don't think I'll go into too much detail about the Potter's Field, but if you want to know more about it, again, you can drop that into the Q&A and we can talk about it a little bit later. But just in brief, this was the city's Potter's Field from 1797 to about 1823, when the Common Council just had too many corpses on its hands, primarily as a result of the yellow fever epidemics that plagued the city back then. And of course, this being rather outside the city limits proper, it was an ideal place for such a burial ground. And there has been ample archaeological evidence unearthed at every turn to demonstrate that this is, of course, far beyond lore, but in fact, a very real place, the burial ground at Washington Square. In the realm of lore is the Hangman's elm. There's a little bit less historical evidence to convince us that this elm tree on the northwest corner of the park is actually the site, or was actually the site, of any hangings ever. We do know there were some executions in the park. They may not have happened at this particular tree, but there is at least one recorded execution on hanging, and execution on record. And I'm sure that you can all tell me what that was, being history buffs yourself. But for those who need a refresher, it was Rose Butler in 1819 who was hanged for the crime of arson. As I said that, I just moved my little candle away from a picture that I think might fall over and knock the whole thing down. I don't want to get in trouble for arson. So there we have our one sort of suspicious ghostly locale. Whether or not there were any hangings on that tree, only history can tell us if it ever reveals its secrets. For now, it's an unknown. Of course, the history of the village is rife with more turbulent histories that are very sad. The tragic history of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire of 1911 is one of these notable stops on pretty much every ghost tour in the Greenwich Village area. When we at Burrows of the Dead stop by this building, we use it as an opportunity to discuss the concept of place memory or residual hauntings, which is less spooky apparitions and more just the idea that a place can sort of be imbued with the spirits of the people who came before. And obviously, if something particularly traumatic happened on that site, there may be some sort of remnant or a vibration, whatever you want to call it, in that particular locale. This is a very sad stop, so we try not to kind of lard it with ghost stories, but we just talk about the concept of these lingering psychic after effects of everything that's occurred in our city. And of course, the Triangle is just, it's a special place, and I think it's one that will live in our memories no matter whether it's haunted or not. I will let you guys decide what you think about that. Moving on from the Triangle, though, on a little more lighthearted note, the village is also chock-a-block with haunted bars and restaurants, including reputedly McSorley's Old Ale House, supposedly haunted by various specters. Some even say Harry Houdini might appear from time to time there. If he did, it would be a lovely hoax. I'm not quite sure he really does appear, but that's what they say. Cooper Union has a wonderful library back when this used to be the Astor Library. Again, new history buffs will know back in 1848, this site was the location of, actually not Cooper Union, sorry, this was the Public Theater. I have the wrong image. The Public Theater was the site of the Astor Library in 1848, and that was reputedly haunted by a librarian named Joseph Cogswell Green. Pardon me for putting the wrong slide in there. I got excited about the notion of libraries and I put in the wrong place. Fire Patrol number 2, though, which is sitting firmly on West 3rd Street, is now, some of you may know this, the home of Anderson Cooper. But once this fire patrol, back when it was actually in use, was supposedly haunted by the specter of a patrolman named Schwartz. Whether or not Schwartz really exists, I can tell you that in this location before the fire patrol house was built around 1901, there was a 3-story townhouse there that was formerly the site of a brothel, and a murder had occurred on that site where the cook was murdered by her jealous lover, and he was hanged for his crime in the tombs in a mass hanging with 3 other killers of women. So whatever happened, fire patrolman on that site, that particular locality has a very turbulent history. Conveniently, it's located right across the street from the former home of none other than Edgar Allan Poe, who lived here just after he wrote The Raven and became quite famous for that. So whether that's actually haunted by the spirit of Edgar Poe or not, it certainly has a wonderful macabre tinge to it. It's everybody's favorite fake house. As you can see, this facade is just sort of glommed onto the side of the building. The house itself is long gone. NYU tore that down about 20 years ago, but they did put this little reminder up and a fun little plaque for everybody who's interested in Edgar Poe. Moving on, we have another favorite ghost of Greenwich Village, Aaron Burr. This is actually the house at 17 Commerce Street that he did own. It was part of his real estate holdings. He had several investment properties. He owned this house, and he is supposedly the former owner of 17 Barrow Street as well. It is said that this was the carriage house of Aaron Burr, moved up from his estate down at Richmond Hill, moved up a few blocks north, planted here, and subsequently haunted by various ghosts, including Aaron Burr, his daughter Theodosia, and a few other hangers-on, including Ziegfeld Follies girls and an old blacksmith. Historical research into the building shows it probably was built long after Aaron Burr left the scene, and it did belong to a blacksmith at one point, which is interesting, corroborating some of the tales I've heard of the place. It does feel haunted when you go inside. Whether it's any connection to Aaron Burr or not, he is a perennial favorite ghost all over New York City. Luckless Aaron Burr. Another fun little ghost is the Firebug Ghost of Waverly Inn. Again, one of just many haunted restaurants in the Greenwich Village area. And this little ghost, there was a ghost they called the Firebug Ghost. He apparently started a terrible fire in the Waverly Inn in the early 90s. I call him a he. I don't know why I always think of him as like an impish little boy. There have been various reports regarding the Firebug Ghost of the Waverly Inn, but he's apparently a child. And I always think of Asylum Street when I think of the Firebug Ghost of the Waverly Inn, because that stretch on West 4th Street, right around just one block over from this place, West 4th, I think it was between 7th Avenue and Gainsford, that stretch there, used to be called Asylum Street, and that is where the New York Orphans Asylum used to be, Eliza Hamilton's orphan asylum. And I always somehow draw a connection between the orphan asylum and the little firebug boy of the Waverly Inn. And I always wonder if he's fascinated by the warmth of the fireplace or the plenitude of the food. I don't know. I make up a little identity for him. His actual identity remains unknown. Marie's Crisis, reportedly haunted as well by the ghost of none other than Thomas Paine. Speaking of founding fathers, he lived on that site just before his death. When he died in poverty in 1809, he had inhabited that building. And it is said among some that his spirit does appear at the bar from time to time. I wonder if he enjoys the festive character of the place now. Of course, some of the village's most famous houses aren't bars or restaurants, schools or libraries. They are, of course, private homes, none more famous than this private home, the Merchant's House Museum, where the ghosts are nothing if not tenacious. This was a story I struggled with. I didn't know whether or not to include it. The Merchant's House is one of my favorite spots. It is a place that I do think is definitely haunted. We include it on our tours very, very often. Here's one of our guides. And I think no tour of the village is really complete. No ghost tour of the village is really complete without a stop at the Merchant's House. However, it's a story that's been told a lot. And I wasn't sure if you guys would still want to hear about Gertrude Treadwell over here on the left, and her stern father, Seabury, and the forbidden love between her and Lewis Walton, a story that's been told quite often. I didn't know how many times you guys had been told about the haunted servants' quarters, these little steel bed frames, metal bed frames on the right here. Or how many times you've been told about the piano playing itself in the parlor, or the bells ringing by themselves down in the kitchen, or the teacups being moved around in empty rooms. I'm going to leave this up to you. If you want me to talk about Merchant's House ghosts, I can talk about them for a long time, ad nauseum, more than anybody ever wants to hear. I'll open that up to you guys in the Q&A. I have lots of stories about this place, so I'm going to leave that on the table for you guys. And of course, everybody's favorite photos. This, I believe, is Eliza Treadwell's bedroom. Yes, it is. That's the child's bed. And it's, I believe, in Eliza Treadwell's bedroom, where by the fireplace, these little ribbons or columns of white mist tend to appear in photographs. These pictures, I think, were taken a decade apart by different photographers, different cameras, different lighting situation, and different angles. We can talk about that if you want. So we'll table the Merchant's House for now. As you can see, I struggled whether or not to include it. But in any case, that's our little overview of Greenwich Village and its various haunted dwellings and other buildings. And the wonderful thing about any ghost tour of Greenwich Village is that it encompasses everything in the entire neighborhood in terms of its history, from its New Amsterdam beginnings to the building booms of the 1830s, when families like the Treadwells began to move in there, to the turn of the century when immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe labored in sweatshops and factories like the Triangle, and as we'll see, even yuppies from the 80s through the early aughts. And you can view all this history through the lens of these ghost stories and the psychic resonances left behind by each generation. Or, as I somewhat glibly summarize it here, a dark history creates a haunted present. 3 of my favorite histories and favorite ghost stories begin over at St. Mark's in the Bowery. I'm almost tempted to open up the Q&A now. Let me see if I click on it. There is a question lingering for me. It can be hard to see in the screen share. I'm gonna come back to you. I'm gonna come back to you because I don't want to stop sharing.
It just says yes, which I think was in response to your question about should you talk about the Merchant's House.
Oh, fabulous, really? Okay. All right, so we have one vote, one extremely emphatic vote for yes.
And also many enthusiastic yes votes in the chat.
Oh, good. You know, this is the problem with being a professional ghost tour guide, is you're always afraid you're going to tell the same old stories over and over again that people have heard a million, billion times, and they're going to be so bored. I'm thrilled that you still want to hear about the Merchant's House. So Ariel, will you just like throw questions at me, you know, as they come up whenever there's a minute? Because I'm just
absolutely.
I'm just gonna roll with this. So let me take a sip of my seltzer water. I'm going to give you guys a little riddle here, that the brand of my seltzer water has something to do with a haunted house in Greenwich Village. You can probably guess what it is if you're a ghost nerd, but if you don't know, you will know by the end of this presentation. I was very excited when I found these cans. Okay. A Merchant's House Museum. Where do I even begin? The Merchant's House Museum is like an old friend to me, because I have been obsessed with it for so many years. And I feel like all paranormal junkies in New York City feel the same way about this building. Even if you're not super into ghosts, I feel like anyone who's stepped into the building, who's crossed this threshold, gets the same feeling, gets the same sense that this house is like an old friend. Some haunted localities push you away, and I'm going to talk about one a little bit later in this presentation that's hostile and pushes you away. I personally feel the Merchant's House Museum invites one in. It is one of the most welcoming haunted houses I've ever encountered. Now, the character of this haunting has changed over the years, and maybe if you were there 20, 30 years ago, you would have a different story. But since I have been aware of this place since about 2009 or so, the ghosts, the tenor of the haunting has been very welcoming, and it's drawn you in, it's invited you in. There's something that creates obsessives in this house. It pulls you in. And I wonder if we all feel the same thing that Gertrude Treadwell felt about her home. She's the member of the Treadwell family most often associated with the house. And it's this wonderful sort of Gothic archetype come to life, like the woman is house archetype. Gertrude was born in the house on September 17th, 1840. She was born in her mother's bedroom, Eliza's bedroom. And she lived in the house her entire life. She died at the age of 80. She died in her father, Seabury Treadwell's bed, just down the hall. And her relationship with her father, it characterizes her ghost story. He was apparently very stern as a parent. He was very old when she was born. I think he was already almost in his late 40s when she was born. And there was this kind of, she was the last of 8 children. And I can't understand whether there was a gulf between them or whether she strove to please him. There's something about their dynamic that's very fraught. And the legend goes, most people agree this is true, that Gertrude fell in love only once in her life. And it was with this super dreamy, handsome doctor here in the center, Lewis P. Walton. And he was Catholic. The Treadwells were Episcopalian, and so the father, Seabury Treadwell, said, no, you cannot marry this man. And she was like, well, then I'll never love again, and she never did. And she lived in the house, an old spinster, very attached to her belongings, attached to her surroundings, long after the death of the rest of her family. And various family members lived with her over the years, but at the very end, she was left alone, the last one standing. And she very meticulously kept her house exactly as it had been in her 19th century childhood, or as Papa would have wanted it, so they say. And so, of course, when she died in 1933, so she was 83, when she died in 1933, her second cousin, George Chapman, came into the house. And this is a wonderful story. He crosses the threshold of this house and he sees everything perfectly preserved, just the way it had been a century ago. And he said, this place has got to be a museum. And right away, he turned it into a museum, and it opened to the public in, I think, 1936. And as soon as it opened to the public, even when the workmen were bringing it up to code, and installing bathrooms and electricity and so on, and updating the wiring, even then, immediately, her ghost began to make itself known. The presence of Gertrude began to become felt around the premises. There are so many stories. There's literally a whole entire book that you can buy in the gift shop of the museum. If you don't have it yet, get it now. It's great October reading. It's called Some Say They Never Left. And it catalogs the voluminous number of ghost stories associated with this house, not just with Gertrude, but with various other family members as well, including, and this is why I include this picture over here, the servants who also figured in the family's ghostly lore. I did mention that the piano has been heard playing by itself on more than one occasion. And there's just dozens of stories of people walking outside the house late at night thinking, you know, how odd it is that the museum would be having an event at 2 in the morning, when of course, obviously they were not. There are numerous stories about cups and dishes and plates being rearranged, stacked in the center of a table in an otherwise empty room, or even in some stories smashed. There are numerous stories of just glimpses of family members, whether it's Phoebe, one of the older sisters, or some have seen Julia, I believe, another sister, to the servants. There's this wonderful story about a docent who was leading a tour to the servants' quarters, and she had just led the last tour of the evening, and she'd closed and locked the door, and then a little kind of narrow, peaky white face just like peered around the corner of the door that she just closed and locked. So these things abound, these tales abound. One of my favorite stories is about the bells. There was a volunteer, she was the site manager working that day, and she had just closed up, and it was New Year's Day. They had this event for New Year's Day. It was an open house, and she had just closed up, and the house had been quite noisy and ringing with laughter and music and stuff all day long, and there was finally some silence at the end of the day. And as she was just cleaning up, putting everything away and tallying up all her receipts and stuff, she suddenly started to hear these bells, these servants' bells, ring out. And of course, the strings are not attached to anything. There's no room in the house where you can pull a bell rope and these bells will start to ring. So these unconnected bells just started to ring by themselves. And I love that kind of like idea of some ghost ringing in the new year. Myself, I have never seen anything. I have not experienced any apparitional events in the house, even though I've gone on various ghost hunts late at night in the house with a little recorder, walking around the house trying to get EVPs. That's electronic voice phenomena, where you record the sound of ghosts. I never caught any EVPs, but I did drain 3 brand new sets of batteries in my recorder, which, according to some, is a sign of something. I did once feel something in the house. I was wearing a sleeveless shirt and I was standing in the front parlor, and I felt very palpably something brushing past me. And it was not a breeze. It was as though someone had brushed past you on the subway. Like you can feel that motion, that movement, and something moved away from me. I could just feel something walking by me. I was standing by the portrait of Seabury at the time, so I wonder if it was him, rather brusquely brushing by me. I'm not sure. I do see the chat lighting up though, so I'm hoping that other people have stories that they will share at the end of this presentation. But there are so many stories, and they tend to occur usually when there's one volunteer in the house locking up at the end of the day, and they lock all the rooms in the house only to find them suddenly unlocked. Or the opposite. They're just about to lock the last room of the house and then find all the doors and windows shuttered and bolted. As though Gertrude is helping speed them along, or maybe not ready for them to leave. Oh man, wow, I'm so tempted to hear. I can see more people chiming in on the chat. I'm so tempted to hear your ghost stories when we come to the end of this presentation. But as much as I adore Gertrude, as much as I love her, and as fun as it is to collect so much paranormal evidence about Manhattan's most haunted house, there are still more places to explore. So hold that thought, and we will get back to the Treadwell family before too long. I'm gonna do a quick time check here, 6:27. Okay, we're gonna rush through a couple centuries of history so we can get to telling some ghost stories like we're around the campfire. But no ghost tour of the village is complete in my mind without a visit from our old friend Pegleg Pete. I don't think I need to introduce Peter Stuyvesant, and I don't think I need to introduce St. Mark's in the Bowery Church. But for those who, again, want a little refresher, this is basically the site of one of the oldest continuous sites of worship in Manhattan. This church itself was built between 1795 and 1799. It's a lovely fieldstone Georgian-era church, and it is built on a plot of farmland that once belonged to Peter Stuyvesant, the Director General of New Amsterdam. And he built a private family chapel on this site way back in the 1680s, I believe it was. 1660s, pardon me. Wouldn't have been the 1680s. I'll tell you why in a minute. He built his private chapel here in the 1660s. And he lived nearby. He had a whole big plot of land adjacent in what is now the East Village in Stuyvesant Town. He had his Bowery farm, hence the name, St. Mark's in the Bowery. And he built his personal private family chapel where he worshiped according to the Dutch Reformed tradition, in which he was a devout believer. And he had his home nearby, and he had his orchards nearby with his various peach and pear trees. And of course, he was buried on that site. He died in 1672. And he was buried on that site. And the church that subsequently was built on that location when his great-grandson sold off the land, that church was built on top of his burial plot. So his vault lies beneath an Episcopal church. If you know anything about Peter Stuyvesant, you'll know that he's a restless ghost. And you can see, it's actually funny because this little bar from the gate, the angle from which this photo was taken, actually hides Peter Stuyvesant's vault, but the vault is right beneath this window. And there's the bust of Peter Stuyvesant over here. But this churchyard, I wanted to get a lovely view of the churchyard. You might know this already, but there are vaults down here, all of which, there's like little steps that lead to them. And there's this whole, it's essentially a crypt underneath this, what looks like a very innocuous yard. You wouldn't even know there was any burials there if you didn't look and you weren't standing right on top of it. But there's a whole warren of crypts under there. And Peter Stuyvesant lies among them. The hauntings of St. Mark's Church are generally attributed to Peter Stuyvesant, mainly because it is said, and there's an example of the vaults, it is said that his spirit is restless and it is unsatisfied and disgruntled with the direction New York City has taken since his death. The idea, of course, is this devout, staunch Dutch Reformed governor of New Amsterdam, a very patriotic Dutchman, is of course irate with the situation of an Episcopal church lying atop his burial place. Episcopal, of course, just another word for Church of England, right? It's just the Anglican Church rebranded for America. So he's not thrilled that his natural enemies, the English, sit atop his burial ground. His spirit was seen quite early on in this vicinity, very soon after his death in 1672. He's kind of like Gertrude Treadwell in that sense, is that he began haunting rather immediately. As early as 1774, it is said that he haunted the remains of his home, which burned in a fire. His home was a little bit east of the church, and it burned in a fire, and it is said that his spirit was seen walking among the smoking rubble the next day after the fire burned the house to the ground. And of course, you can always tell when you're looking at Peter Stuyvesant's ghost, can't you? Because as we all know, Peg Leg Pete, the recipient of some cannon fire in his military days, had only one real leg and one wooden leg. So there's always, of course, the cane and the wooden leg thumping and dragging whenever he walks along, whether it's through smoking rubble or the naves of the church or along 2nd Avenue. Wherever he goes, he makes his presence known, quite noisily, in fact. The most famous story of Peter Stuyvesant's apparition concerns this very bell, which apparently was rung out several times. We have a lot of records from the 1860s talking about this, terrified sextons locking up the church late at night and then hearing this loud phantom sound of a bell ringing out and rushing up to the belfry only to find the door locked and the place empty. In some versions of the story, the bell rope itself was cut and found lying atop the grave the next day. There's a very famous retelling of this story in B.A. Botkin's New York City folklore. B.A. Botkin was a folklorist, really active during the 30s. He did a lot of stuff for the WPA, and part of that was he was collecting ghost stories and folklore of New York City. And there's a lot of wonderful stories of New Amsterdam in this book, including the tale of, I have lost it, there we go, including the tale of the ghost of Peter Stuyvesant. And it tells the tale, the version of which, when the bell rope is cut and then found the next day, the sexton insisted that he found it in Stuyvesant's vault. So if you're looking for, a lot of people will ask me, where do you get these ghost stories from? What are your sources, young lady? And these are the kinds of wonderful old books that you can find delicious ghost stories in. In the book New York City Folklore, this is the only ghost story that I found, but you can find it retold in just about any haunted New York City book, and it's of course all over the internet, but this is one of the kind of definitive retellings of that tale. Good old B.A. Botkin. Another fun thing I like about Peter Stuyvesant is that his ghost was known to appear on Christmas Eve periodically. And his ghost would apparently sometimes join in the singing on Christmas Eve Mass. There's a little more to say about St. Mark's. Some people say that old Peg Leg Pete hasn't been seen in years and years and years. Others say that there's still a presence in the church, particularly in the rectory. And there's some eerie and strange stories. People who work there often feel as though they're being watched. And people who live in the rectory have often had strange and very uncanny psychic experiences when they have dwelt in that place. Another fun story, depending on your definition of fun, is there was a grave robbing that took place there in the 1870s. This is a rather famous story. Alexander T. Stewart, the department store magnate, who was known far and wide for being extremely wealthy, he was buried in a vault in St. Mark's, and a set of ghouls, a couple of grave robbers, came along, dug up his corpse, and held it for ransom, demanding, I believe it was $20,000 from his grieving widow. She paid, I believe, 1/10 of that price to get back a moldering corpse, which she assumed was her husband, and then buried it safely out in Garden City, Long Island. That's another fun little tale. Perhaps responsible in part for what I call the psychic umbrella of St. Mark's. Whether or not you believe there's an old Dutch ghost haunting the place, literally, I do think that when you walk down this particular street, you know, it's on 10th Street. And 10th Street, of course, it juts into Stuyvesant Street. And there's this kind of wonderful sort of confluence, this geographic confluence of streets. And the church is set, therefore, at an angle to the grid system. And it presents this wonderful facade to the city. And looking at it and being in the churchyard, there's a quietude to the churchyard. There's a sense of stillness and peace. And it feels as though time stands still when you're at St. Mark's. And yet it's a very lively parish, as everybody knows. You know, it's this kind of avant-garde parish where there's been a lot of performances, and there's a dance space there. For a while, it was at the forefront and the vanguard of the art scene in the 70s. Patti Smith was reciting poetry there. I mean, this is like a cool, hip, very lively parish, and yet there's a sense that somehow you can fully believe old Pegleg Pete still inhabits the place. And there's that kind of looming spire that faces itself at an angle to the rest of the city, stubbornly refusing to conform to the grid system, which is so very Peter Stuyvesant. I had a clairaudient on one of my tours one time, and that's a person who can hear ghosts. She doesn't see them, but she hears them. And she said that when I was telling my ghost stories of Peter Stuyvesant and the bell, and we were standing by his tomb, she could hear laughter emanating from the tomb. He was quite delighted by the tall tales we told of him, or so she said. The last living Stuyvesant was buried in this tomb in 1953, and then it was sealed off. One of his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandsons, who was a bit of an oddity. He was one of these eccentrics who lived alone and seemed to have one foot in the past. The last remaining Stuyvesant was a very interesting character. There's a cool book by Helen Warden called Out of This World, where she talks not only about Peter Stuyvesant, or the last remaining Stuyvesant, but also about Gertrude Treadwell. And it's a fascinating read. So that's a recommended read if you happen to be able to grab a copy from the library. Do a grab and go. The other house that I'm truly obsessed with in the village, we're going to go a little bit further west now. So we'll stroll away from St. Mark's, and we'll walk a little bit west. We'll walk past Washington Square. We'll walk along Waverly Place to that wonderful, crooked little street, Gay Street. And of course, it's one of the most charming, most photographed streets in the entire Greenwich Village area. People ask about the name a lot. You guys probably know this. There's a little bit of debate about the name. Some people say that Gay Street was named after Sidney Howard Gay, who was a prominent abolitionist. But the very first records of Gay Street in the Common Council minutes date from 1827, when he was only 13 years old. So we believe that it was probably named after a local landowner sometime around the mid-1820s. So the name doesn't have anything to do with the LGBT community surrounding it, but it's of course a wonderful and delightful coincidence, and everybody loves the name and loves the street. Aesthetically, it's one of the most charming streets in the entire village area, or so I believe, and many people agree. And these wonderful little row houses here, many people say that this was a mews, and it's widely believed that these were the houses of servants and people who worked on the surrounding larger houses around the Washington Square area. And so they're rather small in scale and rather humble, but they're these delightful little houses. And of course, number 16 Gay Street is just all covered with this wonderful climbing wisteria vine. Wisteria has its own wonderful symbolism in the language of flowers, deeply associated with the spirit world. And it's very magical as a street. And 12 Gay Street itself, the house, is very compelling. as a house. Oh, here's another wonderful kind of shot of that crooked, winding lane. The whole street, there's almost something interesting in every single house on the street. Number 14, right next to number 12 Gay Street, is where Ruth McKenna wrote the play My Sister Eileen, that was later made into a movie. There's a sad story about that. Her sister, the titular sister, actually died in a car crash like the night before the play was supposed to debut on Broadway, and she never saw it. So there's a kind of little weight around that at number 14. And then, do I have it here in my slides? Oh, Wouter. We'll come back to Wouter. Where's my other wonderful story that I love about 12 Gay Street? Here it is. This is a fun fact for anyone who read this book as a child. The YA classic, The Weston Game, was written at 12 Gay Street by Ellen Raskin, who also wrote another YA book called The Tattooed Potato at that location, and she described the house in detail. I'm a big fan of that book, and I was really delighted when I found out that she actually lived at 12 Gay Street. And that's where I got this little title from, Ghosts or Worse. That's one of the chapter titles from that YA classic that was so formative to me as a child. And it was really weird to find out that this was the house where it was written. So much has happened at 12 Gay Street. And I've given you little previews by kind of jamming through my slides there. But just to kind of back up, this is Wouter van Twiller. He preceded Peter Stuyvesant as one of the Director Generals of New Amsterdam. He was one of the first. And he actually had a brewery at this location, so it was said, in the 17th century, going back to the very earliest origins for a moment. And then later on, this street, like I said, was kind of inhabited mostly by working class people. And there's a little laundress doing her laundry in front of her lovely Federal style row house on Gay Street. That dates from about the 1890s. But the ghost stories don't really start until the 20th century at 12 Gay Street, when this rather innocuous townhouse becomes a den of sin. And you might have seen a little sneak peek here of our friend, Mayor Jimmy Walker, everybody's favorite mayor, right? Mayor Jimmy Walker, most people know this, he was really the party mayor of New York City during the Roaring 20s and part of the early 30s. He was a songwriter by trade, very uninterested in politics. I believe his major civic contribution to the city was building a casino in Central Park for him and his friends. He had very famously a mistress called Betty Compton, and he bought the house at 12 Gay Street for her. And they partied. You can see them here having a good time. They're dancing. They're in their very best suits and fox stoles. Wow, that's a dead animal. Okay. And they apparently just really lived it up at the house. They had these very notorious alcohol-fueled parties. I can imagine the bathtub champagne was flowing. Some say, and it depends on who you talk to and what you read, but some say that immediately prior to Betty Compton taking ownership of the house, there was actually a speakeasy. Some say bootleggers lived here. Some say there was a speakeasy here called the Pirate's Den, quite a notorious speakeasy. Either way, whether a bootlegger lived there or whether there was a speakeasy there, I would say the transition from that to being Betty Compton's house was fairly seamless. Again, lots of lavish parties there, soirees that went on all night. And apparently, according to some, never ended. Gay Street, it is said, has been haunted by a phantom seen wearing top hat and tails. It's a male phantom. He wears a cloak, like a full formal opera gown kind of outfit, maybe something Jimmy Walker would wear on a night out on the town. The phantom has been seen and witnessed mainly by people who live in the house, and he's accompanied by other phenomenon, for example, audible phenomena like champagne corks popping or footsteps, sometimes walking, sometimes dancing, laughter, the sound of glasses clinking, always as though somebody's having a really good time. Footsteps are often reported, like I said, and phantom smells often accompany these revels. The strangest one is the smell of frying onions. That's reported a lot, often at strange times when most people aren't frying onions, like 3 a.m., unless you're having a little Welsh rarebit, which is what they always had back in those days, right? When they were having their late night snacks. And of course, the smell of violets would sometimes waft through, so a little reprieve from your smell of onions. And these phenomena were reported quite heavily and frequently in the 1950s when a gentleman named Frank Parris lived in the house. He complained the most about the ghosts. Oh, there's a lovely, lovely vintage photograph. That's 14 and 16. The gentleman who lived in the house during the 1950s was Frank Paris, who invented this little guy, Howdy Doody. Frank Paris, the puppeteer, lived there with his partner, T.E. Lewis, and they lived there till 1971. And he is the one who reported seeing a gentleman in top hat and tails and an opera cape. And this male specter with his fancy garb, the strangest thing about this male specter was that he seemed to be shrouded in a kind of mist, except for his eyes, which according to Paris, sparkled quite brilliantly. The specter appeared and then dissolved after a few minutes. Here's the twist though. Before Frank Paris lived in the house, there was a writer who lived there called Walter Gibson. Walter B. Gibson, who wrote The Shadow under a pseudonym of Maxwell Grant. He wrote not only The Shadow comic books, the radio plays, the novelizations. He churned out hundreds of thousands of words a month while he lived in the attic on Gay Street. And he wrote so intensely that some believe, and you can see the shadow here in his hat and possibly his cape, some people believe, this is a theory posited by a very reliable source, John Keel, author of the Mothman Prophecies. Some people believe that the specter Frank Paris witnessed, the gentleman in the top hat and the opera cape, wasn't a traditional specter. It was a tulpa. A tulpa. This notion is prevalent in Tibetan Buddhism. It's the idea of a sentient thought form, basically. And the concept at play here is that Walter Gibson essentially thought the shadow into being, that he somehow created this form, who then later appeared to fellow artist and creator Frank Paris. Frank Paris actually thought it was a traditional specter. He didn't, subscribe to this theory. He thought it was an actual, honest to goodness, dyed-in-the-wool ghost. But the idea that the spirit haunting Gay Street is actually the sentient thought form of the shadow is kind of too delicious for me to pass up. So that's something that I really enjoy talking about. Sidebar on Walter B. Gibson. He was amazing. This is my very battered copy of The Complete Illustrated Art of the Psychic Sciences. He wrote a lot about telepathy, clairvoyance, divination, parapsychology, everything, you name it. He wrote about it, tarot, graphology. He wrote this book with his wife, Gibson. And he was a prolific writer, not only on supernatural phenomena, not only the shadow, but he also wrote about magic. He was really into magic. He invented a very notable rope trick. I guess if you are a magician, you might know the rope trick he invented, but he was a master of sleight of hand. And he also ghost wrote a lot of stuff for Harry Houdini, Howard Thurston, and Harry Blackstone. So he was very good friends with a lot of magicians and illusionists. He worked in that world, moved in that world, very highly respected. If it was about ghosts, magics, the supernatural, he was into it. So he's a really fascinating figure, very prominent in all of these worlds. And the fact that he lived right there on Gay Street, this haunted townhouse, to me is one of the most delicious and wonderful things in all the world. Walter Gibson, by the way, he used to participate in the Houdini seances too, up at the Magic Townhouse uptown after Houdini died in 1926. So he did quite a lot of work beyond the orthodox sciences. He did. It's funny, I was flipping through this book and I just very randomly opened it to the part where he's talking about graphology. And one of the signatures, oops, there goes the spine. One of the signatures that he analyzes is the signature of our good friend Edgar A. Poe, his close neighbor down on West 3rd Street. And my book will open to that page forevermore. Haha. I love 12 Gay Street. I will always love 12 Gay Street. If any of you live in 12 Gay Street, please befriend me and I will come and visit you. See if we can hear the plaintive taps of the ghost that Frank Paris claimed to have encountered. He heard plaintive taps on the wall when he was moving out, as though the ghost was bidding him a fond farewell. If you live at the next house we're going to visit, I might politely decline an invitation to join you, because the final house on our tour is the House of Death. The House of Death is a place I cannot rightly call a favorite. It is too frightening to be a favorite. And I'm sorry if you live there. I don't mean to badmouth your home. But remember when I was talking about the Merchant's House as a place that invites you in, filled with welcoming ghosts? This is the kind of place that pushes you out. One day I was curious walking by the House of Death, which I'm fascinated by. and I noticed the front door was a little bit ajar. Some workmen were coming in and out, and they propped open the door. And I walked in, just fueled by my own morbid curiosity, and I walked in, and as I walked through it, I walked into there's 10 apartments there now. I remember walking towards the rear, and I think I went up some stairs. I was struck by the number of baby strollers in the hallway. As I walked through the space, I remember feeling quite distinctly unwelcome, as though something in there was telling me to get out and that I should not be there. And to the end of my days, I'll never know if that was my own conscience telling me that I was really trespassing in a private building and I shouldn't be there snooping around, and it was not, the right thing to do, whether it was my conscience telling me to get out because I was trespassing, or whether there was something in that building that was just like, get out, go. I don't claim to be psychic. I don't claim to have clairvoyant abilities, but even me, who's pretty tone deaf on the spectrum of psychic abilities, felt a very palpable sense of things not quite being right and me not really wanting to linger there. It's another shot of the House of Death with these wonderful autumnal bare trees. Unfortunately, I didn't get a really good close-up of that little plaque there, but you'll see by the door there's a little plaque, and you can walk by and see it one day if you're strolling by, and it will just tell you that Mark Twain lived there from 1900 to 1901, I believe, and that is true. He did live there. We're going to talk about that in a second. But I want to clear the air first, because this is very problematic on a ghost tour, to talk about these things and to benefit from these things, to create monetary revenue streams from this place. It is a problematic place because you cannot, with any levity, no jokes, no fun, no good times, you cannot stand in front of this place and talk about this, and then all go off on your merry way without being deeply disturbed and affected. This is, of course, as many New Yorkers will remember from the late 1980s, the residence of Joel Steinberg, whose young daughter, and you can see her here, this is Lisa, was murdered in this house. He murdered her. And that's all I want to say about this child murder. It is a well-known case. If you don't know much about it, the Joel Steinberg case is easily researchable online. And I just want to leave it at that. I don't want to linger on that. All I will say is that so far, thankfully, there have been no reported accounts of any spirit activity related to this child who was murdered on that site. I don't want to even go there. I will mention that way beyond and before and much earlier historically than Joel Steinberg ever set foot in the place, there had been very macabre, lingering stories about various apparitions and things that had taken place on that site. So the darkness of the House of Death predates him by several years. Whether he was influenced by the provenance of that house or not, I'm not even going to speculate on. I'm going to move on to the next slide and take it back to the turn of the century. We're going to talk about Mark Twain. Mark Twain, when he lived there, never saw a ghost, didn't believe in ghosts. He was a very adamant skeptic, and he wrote about his skepticism, and he embraced that notion, and he was very forthright about not believing in ghosts and not thinking that they were real. And yet, what's funny about Mark Twain is he actually had a genuine precognitive dream when he was a young man, foreseeing his own brother's death in a steamboat accident and an explosion. And he would think about that later in life. I feel that he may have reversed his position on the supernatural and the paranormal and clairvoyance as he aged. But Mark Twain, incidentally, ironically perhaps, although he only lived there for a brief period, is one of the ghosts that people say they see. And oddly enough, they see him in his signature white suit. There are accounts of him standing in the stairway inside the house saying, "My name is Clemens and I have something I gotta settle." So, hey, there's Samuel Clemens for you. I don't know if he's there or not, but if he is there, he's not alone. He is not alone by a long shot. One of the most famous stories about this house, which is supposed to be haunted by the spirits of no fewer than 22 people who died on that site, is the story of a psychic attack, a sustained psychic attack on this woman here, Brian Bartel, the author of Spindrift. And every single ghost tour guide in the city of New York probably owns this book, or should own this book. This is one of the definitive stories of 14 West 10th Street. 14 West 10th Street and 16 West 10th Street, where she also lived for several years. She moved into 16 West 10th Street in 1957, and she lived there for almost a whole decade, and then she moved into 14 West 10th Street. And she had haunted experiences in both of those locations, actually more in 16 than in 14. The hauntings that she experienced they began as feelings. So Jan Brian Bartel, she was an actress, she was a poetess. You can see her bio here on the dust jacket. She was a very highly strung person. She had finely wound nerves. She always talks about this and references this in her book. She was very creative. She was very artistic. She was prone definitely to depression and other bouts of deep melancholy. Essentially, she was a very susceptible person when it came to being haunted by her house. I've always said that hauntings require two things. You need the haunted place and you need the receptive person, and they need to go together. I'm sure there's plenty of people living in haunted houses who are immune to these things and it doesn't bother them. And then there are people who are, very sensitive like Jan, and when you move in, it's just trouble from day one. So she moves into 16 West 10th Street in 1957, and she is married to a man named Fred who works in the restaurant business. So he's out of the house a lot, and he's gone nights, he works late, and she's home alone a lot. And they live in the 4th floor attic apartment of 16 West 10th Street in the former servants' quarters. And she gets this sense, like almost immediately, as soon as all their stuff is moved in, she gets this very foreboding sense that there's something in the room with her. And there's this one particular spot in this one particular room where she sees a dark shadow hovering on the wall. She calls it a monstrous shadow, a monstrous moving shadow that loomed up behind. So there's this very strong malevolent presence there in the house with her. And the first time she encounters it, she says it took several minutes, several cigarettes, cups of tea, and nips of brandy to shake off that feeling. Later, as these visits would become more sustained, her brandy and cigarettes turned into bottles and bottles of Valium. There's a reference in the book to the winter she spent on Valium. Like she becomes very, very deeply unsettled by these psychic attacks, as she characterizes them. So she'll be going up the steps, and footsteps will follow her. As she walks up the stairs, she'll hear these footfalls behind her. She'll feel what she says she describes as like a hairbrush scraping the nape of her neck, as though something is trying to brush her hair, which, as I'm thinking about it, is the creepiest sensation I can possibly imagine. The idea that some phantom hand is trying to brush your hair. There's a particular chair in that particular room where she saw the monstrous shadow right when she moved in. Her dogs, she had 2 dogs, they would snarl and bark at this one chair. And then there's a very funny story. It's a very well-known story about her house. Apparently one day she was doing the dishes and she saw a shriveled grape lying in the center of a stack of dishes that had just been washed. And she was convinced this grape was an aport. Her husband, who was a skeptic, said, it's probably like a mouse running through the kitchen. He dropped this grape. And she's like, no, it's an aport. It's an object transported from the other side, beyond the veil. It's dropped here, and it's a harbinger of my death. And she starts to make this ghostly attack very personal. And it's not, just a nebulous kind of haunting. It is directly aimed at her, and it's not only aimed at her, but it's aimed at her with the idea of bringing about her own death. It seems to want to suck her into the other side, and she becomes obsessed with the idea of her own death. She does see apparitions. She sees a male spirit, and she reaches out to touch it, and her fingers get icy cold, and then she often smells a cloying scent like perfume. She also sees a little gray cat just darting through her bathroom one day. She doesn't have a cat. She's a dog lady. So she's like, who's this cat? Finally, her husband's like, look, I also see something. One day he finally sees a dog growling at the chair. And he's like, all right, look, you've been complaining about this for 5 years. Let's bring in somebody to talk about this. And the man she brings in to talk about this is none other than Hans Holzer, who's pretty well known, but for those who don't know Hans Holzer, he was this very, very famous ghost hunter. He was really active in the 50s, around the time that Jan was experiencing these things. The 50s through the 70s, that was kind of his heyday as well, coinciding with hers. And, he was a really well-known guy. He was writing books about these things, and she calls him up, and he comes with a psychic. He brings in, I believe, Mrs. Ethel Johnson Myers, and this medium, she comes in and she reads the house, and she says there's the spirit of a woman named Renee Mallison, Irene Mallison, who was a woman from the Civil War era whose husband had gone off and been killed in war, and who had had a stillborn child, which was buried under the floorboards, naturally. It's funny because Jan, who was really getting deeply into psychical research at the time, she finds this visit less than credible. She finds Mrs. Myers less than credible. She doesn't really believe anything Hans Holzer says, and she kind of disregards what they have to say. Hans Holzer, whatever you believe about him, for better or for worse, whether you love him and read everything he's ever written, or whether you think he's a total fraud, I will say that historical research is not his strong suit. So if you are an aspiring ghost tour guide and you read anything Hans Holzer writes and it references history in any way, shape, or form, please be sure to fact check it. He has a very fast and loose grip on historical facts. So that's just my caveat about Holzer. But God bless him, he wrote enough material to keep any ghost tour guide busy for the rest of her life. Now, Renee, the spirit that Mrs. Myers said she saw, apparently was quoted as saying to Jan, "This is my house and I will never leave." So housing shortage or no, it's time for Jan and Fred to move on. And stunningly, they move next door, which is an interesting turn of events. Despite all her psychic research and her heavy reading into the topic of ghosts and apparitions, Jan somehow failed to remember that ghosts can walk through walls. And so she moves right next door. She moves to the adjoining house. You can see it right here on the book cover. This is 16 West 10th Street, that's 14th. They move into an apartment in number 14 West 10th Street that actually shares a wall with their old apartment. So I'm not surprised, I don't think Jan would have been surprised, that the hauntings continued. They continued, and she eventually became so obsessed with this notion that this whatever entity was haunting the place was directly trying to facilitate her death. She became so obsessed with her own death. She had these horrible dreams about attending her own funeral, rather Mark Twainish. Eventually, they were just like, we're leaving. I think Fred probably put his foot down and he said, we gotta go. And they moved to New Rochelle. They moved to a nice suburban house, totally non-haunted. And Jan writes this very famous book, Spindrift. She finishes this book in 1974 and she dies, 1973. She dies right after she hands the manuscript in to her publisher of a heart attack, almost immediately right after she hands in this manuscript. She dies of a heart attack at the age of 51 in New Rochelle. And then the book is published shortly after in 1974. The book has this wonderful ending where she essentially tries to transfer the curse of 14 West 10th Street over to you, where she essentially says, reader, for me, this book has been a kind of exorcism, but perhaps for you, the haunting has just begun, in so many words. The spindrift, which she refers to as the spray from the psychic sea, she says, if the spindrift has not reached you yet, it will. So there's this wonderful kind of curse that she passes on to us, and the tradition of 14 West 10th Street haunting its inhabitants is handed over to everyone who visits it and becomes obsessed with it. It's almost like the bizarro merchant's house. Rather than being a wonderful, comforting obsession, it's a horrific, frightening obsession, and one that you can never unsee once you've seen it. So, on that note, I hope you are thoroughly frightened by the House of Death at 14 West 10th Street. And I also hope you might be inspired to ask me a few questions or share a few of your own stories with me. If you just can't get enough Burrows of the Dead and ghost stories, I'm going to leave this up here. This is our website and our Twitter handle, our Instagram. And I don't know if anybody would like to tip. I don't know what the process is for these kinds of talks, but we just throw our Venmo and PayPal info up here. It's the tour guide way. And this has been quite a rough year for tour guides, so little contributions are most appreciated if you can spare it too. I know it's rough out there for everyone, so no pressure, but I'm just gonna put that up there for you all. So Ariel, I don't know if you want to read me a couple of questions in the Q&A just to kind of get the ball rolling. I want to kind of leave this up here. I want to leave this up here for a few minutes so you can all follow us on Instagram and tweet about how much you love us. Sponsored.
I would say that the first thing to address is your child
screaming in the background. Did you enjoy that? I love
it. Great. Glad we got that out of the way. There are many questions.
I hope the sound of the screaming children wasn't too bad. I will actually tell you guys, that's not even my child. My child is quietly watching TV in the next room. Those are the kids playing in the courtyard. So, you know, we're in one of these, we're actually in a co-op that dates back to 1917. And the kids in the courtyard, they echo like crazy. So those are just the neighbors' kids. If my kid was there, it should be much louder than that.
Great.
Sorry about that.
Tish wanted a clarification on who the author of Out of This World is.
Helen Worden, Worden. Might be Helen Worden Smith. I think maybe she hyphenated later. But yeah, Helen Worden. Out of This World is awesome. And she also wrote a book called Round Manhattan's Rim, which just walks around Manhattan Island.
Let's see. What is the magic townhouse that you mentioned in relation to Walter Gibson?
Right. That was a store that was uptown. It was a magic store. And I don't actually have the precise location, but the magic townhouse is Towne, town with a T. The magic townhouse was a store that was, you know, you could buy magic supplies there and stuff like that, and they would have these seances every year. I think that the seances now have moved to the Houdini Museum in Scranton, and I don't know if the magic townhouse still operates. I don't know if that's a actual retail emporium anymore, but it was for many years, for a long time. So.
Thanks.
Now I'm gonna go close the window. Sorry, you guys. I'm so used to the screaming of children. It won't make a whole lot of difference. I don't have good windows.
Oh my gosh. Okay, let's see. Okay, Alina writes, you said hauntings have two prerequisites, a location and a willing/open person.
That's my personal theory. That's not like holy writ, but that's what
I mean, I'm guessing that there aren't hard and fast rules about this necessarily. She wants to know though, can you expand on what you think it takes, what you think takes one into connection with the spirit realm?
So I think that openness to the spirit realm is just like an ability to sing. There's a spectrum, and there's tone deaf people on one end, and there's people with perfect pitch on the other end. And it's innate, and you are one way or another. You can practice and get a little bit better, but there's, you know, there's just going to be a certain aptitude for it. And there are just some people that walk into a room, they're like, ghost, 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 there's one behind you, and I'm out. And there's others that are like, what? And there's a ghost directly on top of their head, and they'll never know it. So wherever you are on the spectrum, that's going to influence whether or not you have any awareness of your house being haunted, or you are completely immune to it. Again, this is my personal theory, and I've predicated this theory on an idea that there is something that exists out there. I think that ghosts may be like a historical residue. I don't know if I necessarily believe that a ghost is a spirit of a deceased person necessarily. I think it may be more of a haunting, and I think those are distinct things. I think hauntings really make a lot of sense, you know, scientifically. There's just this kind of energy that's layered onto something, and I think there are multiple ways of tapping into that, and it doesn't necessarily have to always be an apparitional experience. You can feel something in your gut, you can be a little clairsentient, you can be a little clairaudient, you can have a dream that's precognitive, or even a dream that just is unusual. And so I think openness is partly attitudinal, partly innate, but I do think there is another layer to this world, and you can choose to engage with it, or you can close it off. And I just think that the more open you are, the more chance you'll have of engaging with that world. I mean, I don't know. I hope that answers your question a little bit. You have to be crazy, basically, to see ghosts. You have to be plumb crazy.
In good ways, I think. Folks are asking some questions about other spots in the village.
Yep. Yeah, the ones
including Barrow Street.
Yep.
And Cafe Wa. I wonder if there's a reason that Edward asked about that.
About the Cafe Wa?
Yeah.
I have like a very vague recollection of reading about the Cafe Wa being haunted in one of those, like, you know, haunted New York City books. Nothing leaps to mind in terms of a specific ghost at that cafe. I do know that on West 3rd Street, you know where there's like an NYU D'Agostino residence hall now? There used to be like the Cafe Bazaar was there, and back when the Cafe Bazaar was there, people said that was haunted. I'll have to look up the Cafe One and get back to you about that specifically. But I would say, you know, you could throw a stone in that like strip, and sure, I'm sure there's a ghost in every basement. I really do believe that, you know, it's just, they're still there, and they just haven't all been recorded and uncovered and talked about ad nauseum. On Burrows Street, though, like, yeah, 17 Burrows Street, one if by land, two if by sea, that, you know, the reference I'd made to Aaron Burr's carriage house. I mean, that's a place that gets talked about a lot. And, you know, it's kind of funny because, like, the historical record really says there's not much connection to Aaron Burr there specifically. And yet there's a lot of people who have worked there and who have gone there, and, you know, whether there's psychics visiting it for work or they're just people visiting it to have a nice dinner. There are many accounts that you can feel something in that space. And there's like a really nice, I remember I saw this on YouTube. It was like one of these haunted New York shows. And there's this really nice way of phrasing it from the former sommelier that used to work at One If by Land. His name was Kirk Adair. And he said that you can feel the ghosts in that house at 17 Barrow Street. And they're like birds in the forest. You can't see them, but you know they're there. You're aware of their presence. And it was just this wonderful feeling of being surrounded by ghosts. Whether it's actually Theodosia Burr, who honestly I don't think would spend a lot of time in a carriage house, you know, doesn't seem her style really. And then the funny thing is about the stories there too, is they say that she like plucks the earrings off of female guests, which is something, it's a motif that appears in a lot of folklore, especially Southern folklore, and it's usually servants who do that. It's funny how these things, they kind of just, they bleed into each other. And I don't know really like who the first person is to ever say that. But I think that there is something very interesting about 17 Barrow. And again, who knows, maybe 15, 19, and 21 Barrow are also haunted. And again, that was the original location actually back when it was, I want to say Reason Street. I think that's where the initial location of the orphan asylum was. I mean, so, you know, there's just, like I said, so many strata, so many layers. If you start peeling it back, I bet you could pick any house at random, any location at random, and once you start looking, you'll find something. So that's my opinion on Barrow Street. I'll get back to you on Cafe Wa.
All right. Also, reading/biography recommendations, if they exist, for Walter Gibson and Jan Bartel.
Yeah. So Jan only ever wrote one full-length book, and it's Spindrift. And you can find it on 8 Books or, you know, any other used book website. It's no longer in print, although I think somebody should bring it back in print and republish it, and I will write the foreword. But you can find this online used, and the works of Walter Gibson they're expansive. They're enormous. I would start by just kind of, you know, you can even just go on Wikipedia and there's probably a whole bibliography. He wrote dozens and dozens of books. So, I mean, I just have the illustrated Art of the Psychic Sciences, and it's really crappy paperback edition. The complete illustrated book of the Psychic Sciences. But I would just maybe start by, you know, winnowing through his bibliography and seeing what interests you. I mean, are you interested in rope tricks or numerology, you know, and kind of take it from there. But can't go wrong with Walter Gibson.
Are there biographies about them that are out?
Oh, you know what? There is no book-length biography of Brian Bartel that I know of, but now I have another idea for a book proposal I'm going to write. And although she still has like living friends in New Rochelle, there's still people you can talk to. So to be written, that book is yet to be written. And then in terms of whether there's a book-length bio of Walter Gibson, I actually don't know if there is. TBD. I'm more than happy to research this and get back to you. We have on our website, there's a page called like Haunted References and Resources, and we list a lot of the books that we like, and we keep adding to that page and updating it. So you can always check our references and resources on our website, because I'll surely look into that. And if I find a good Walter Gibson bio, I'll list that there. So I'm gonna write that down. Let me do my little homework here.
And Carolyn is asking about why the House of Death is called the House of Death.
Just because I think it initially got that little moniker during the Joel Steinberg days. You know, it was the site of this child murder. And then it kind of, you know, over the years expanded to include the ghost stories as well. Especially as those ghost stories got more and more popular. It's funny because I don't know when ghost tours in New York City became such a thing. Like when I started working as a ghost tour guide in 2011, and there was like 2 companies that did ghost tours in this city. And like Joyce Gold did one like every year. And then I know, she's rad. And she has this amazing spirit photo. Anyway, she's great. And then over the years, more and more companies have started popping up, and there have been more and more tour guides, and the story of Brian Bartel and the story of the House of Death has grown and grown and grown, and it's talked about a lot, and like it's way more, like every blog in the world has something about that house, including yours. And you know, so it's just kind of, in the beginning when I bought my copy of Spindrift back in the day, it was like, I don't know, $20, and now it's $50, you know, as people are buying up more and more copies of it. And I was one of the first guides to start really using that book really heavily in my tours. I remember once I accidentally called Jessica Steinberg, and then I was walking by and I saw another tour guide. I swear to God, I was walking by a few months later and I saw another tour guide repeating my stories verbatim and even calling her Jessica. And I was like, oh, wow. So, I mean, I don't know, but it's come to the point now where the House of Death is just like, it's so prominent and it's so prevalent that if you Google it, and maybe this is only my Google search history, which says a lot about me, but if you Google it now, like on Google Maps, it's labeled the House of Death. Or it might come up as the Mark Twain house, and that depends on who you know, what your search history looks like. So go Google it, let that be a litmus test to find out if you're literary or if you're a ghoul, and see what that says about you. It could be a new form of divination, Google-mancy.
Oh my gosh. You never know. I mean,
yeah,
it's very, very Black Mirror sounding.
Oh my God. We are living in that now, right?
A little bit sometimes it feels that way, yeah. But luckily we have these wonderful ghost stories to kick off October with together. I think I'm gonna call it here. We have a couple other questions, but I think we're about out of time. So I will send you the questions, Andrea, if you want to see them.
Yeah. And I mean, you can always email us, or you can tweet at us, or ask us on Instagram or Facebook. You know, we're always more than happy to, as you can tell, talk about this until forces us to shut up.
Yes, Maria wants to know about your seltzer.
Spindrift.
Oh, there it is.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm trying to work out a sponsorship deal with this company.
Good luck. If there's
tens of dollars.
Any marketers here, be aware. Andrea, thank you so much. This was such a pleasure, and thanks to everyone for being here with us and for being so active in the chat. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you, Ariel, and thank you, Lena. Thank you so much to all of you. And apologies for the screaming children, you know. That's just
city living.
My dungeon is overflowing. What can I say? I do not have a dungeon where I keep screaming children, for the record. Okay. Happy October.
Everyone. Happy October, everyone. See you soon.
Thanks, everyone.